Good afternoon, everyone. So according to my cell phone, it says 12 p.m. So I'd just like to welcome everyone here. My name is Chelsea Croshoe, and I am the Senior Advisor for the Cultural Competency Program with Alberta Health Services with the Aboriginal Health Program. So this has been a collaborative approach, actually, presentation with the Aboriginal Health Program team. I do welcome any people who are online from the Aboriginal Health Program to help support, answer any questions that are posed during the Q&A period. I do have some of my team members here with me as well that will provide some answers to those questions. And if we can't answer them, we will find out the answers for you and get back to you. So. We are going to start out actually with a couple of videos highlighting, some misconceptions. The first one that we're going to go to is with Wob Canoe. And for those who have been tapping into our series, we did have the 8th Fire series highlighted as a video teleconference session. This one is 2 minutes long and gives you sort of a snapshot of some of those misconceptions that are out there. And then our next video after that is entitled "Understanding Aboriginal Identity," and is a great video in continued understanding of Aboriginal identity and how we identify, or how a person may identify.
Hey Canada, I'm Wob Canoe. I know I'm not your boyfriend, but wouldn't mind being your man on the side. But for this thing to work, there's 5 things you're going to have to stop saying about my people. First thing, alcohol. The big thing that separates us here isn't the alcohol, it's the poverty. Because when a non-native person passes out, they do it at a curling club or at a Nickelback concert. But when a native person does, they do it on the street, which is shameful, but oh so comfortable. Then there's this whole idea of get over it. Why don't you guys just get over it? You know what? I am over it. My dad was raped in a residential school by a nun. I'm over it. But it doesn't mean that we should forget it. Then there's the long hair thing. Some Aboriginal people do wear their hair long as a symbol of cultural pride. Those are the natives with beautiful long straight hair. For curly haired Ojibwe such as myself, hair clippers have been the greatest invention of the white man since the mirror. Then I often hear this question: what are you guys doing with the $7 billion? The $7 billion we give Indian Affairs, what are you guys doing with it? You know what? That money has to pay for a population the same size as New Brunswick. You know what New Brunswick spends on their population? $8 billion. And yet I never hear Canadians ask, hey, New Brunswick, what are you doing with your $8 billion? Finally, one of your favorites, taxes. Guess what? I'm a status Indian. I pay income tax. I pay sales tax. I once even paid a land transfer tax. Ironic. It's all part of a much larger stereotype that Aboriginal people in Canada are getting a free ride. 140 years after the treaties, we're still waiting for the things that we were promised in those agreements to share the land. So I ask you, who's really getting the free ride?
But this next, I really enjoy this next video. It really gives an understanding of how people identify as being Aboriginal, and everyone might identify differently, or the way they see themselves within their community. So it's a great snapshot into that, and just a great series. Bears Paw Media actually produced this, and they've got a lot of great other videos that are accessible out there. So if you're needing some education materials, this is another great avenue. So Al, if I can get you to load up the video.
Whether you only had to read half the books in law school.
Parents or grandparents didn't want to identify as Aboriginal because of the prejudice that some of them had to face. The reality was it was there.
In high school, they would run around me and do woo, and that was one instance, I think, where I felt, my goodness, these people don't even know who I am. They only see the TV Indian person.
All of these are images which don't conform to anything about lived reality. And in any case, when that arises, then people are endangered in various ways. And they become dehumanized, and they become the subjects of all kinds of dangerous practices.
For decades, partial truths and stereotypes have formed the Canadian public's ideas of Aboriginal peoples. But how have these perceptions affected our individual and collective sense of identity? What are the factors that shape who we are as Aboriginal peoples?
long ago when explorers sailed west from Europe in their wooden ships. They sought a northwest passage to the Orient. What they found was a new world.
Since the first early interactions between European colonists and Aboriginal peoples of Canada, a number of treaties, acts, and laws were established. Early settlers made up labels to identify Aboriginal peoples, which are still used today. Indians, Eskimos, Indigenous, Native American, First Nations, treaty, status, non-status, urban Indian, Inuit, and Métis. Ultimately, the legal control over who is an Aboriginal person still resides with the federal government.
Being Aboriginal is both a public or cultural perception, but it's also a legal category. The Indian Act today creates several legal categories of Aboriginal people, and those people have that legal standing only through participation in that system.
There are many distinct Aboriginal cultural groups across Canada, from Cree to Ojibwe to Gitxsan to Blackfoot, each with their own unique customs, culture, and traditions. However, the Canadian Constitution only groups Aboriginal people into 3 legal categories: Indians, Métis, and Inuit.
When you think about it historically, our communities had our own ways of defining who was a community member, and it wasn't based on race or blood quantum or any of those things. We had ways of adopting people into our nations, ways of integrating between nations, and ways of continually evolving and defining ourselves as who we are. Identities have always been changing throughout time, right? And we've always had the right to do that. And it was with this, interference on the part of the state that suddenly it became so prescribed and so static about who is what and what you are. Why, as Indigenous people in Canada, are we distinct in terms of identity issues? Is because it's been formed for us by the state.
The Indian Act is federal legislation first passed in 1876. For over a century, the Indian Act has controlled every aspect of Aboriginal life and identity. To be federally recognized as an Indian, individuals must be able to comply with a very distinct standard of government regulation laid out in the Indian Act. These are the different legal categories of Aboriginal people. Status Indian, a person who is legally registered as an Indian under the Indian Act. Non-status Indian, a person who is not registered as an Indian under the Indian Act. Inuit, an Aboriginal people in northern Canada who live in Nunavut, Northwest Territories, northern Quebec, and northern Labrador. Métis, people of mixed First Nation and European ancestry who identify themselves as Métis, as distinct from First Nations people, Inuit, or non-Aboriginal people. First Nations, a term that came into usage in the 1970s to replace the word Indian. However, no legal definition of it exists.
The laws of Canada have primarily been exclusive. The main focus of them is to limit who can be Indian, at a loss, I think, of a much fuller, deeper, richer understanding of who we are as a peoples.
If you look at the various definitions of indigenousness, it comes down to a particular set of things. Sometimes it's priority. Are you the descendant of the group that was there first? Sometimes it has to do with cultural practice. For example, do you have a particular kind of spirituality and you are not a member of a world religion like Islam or Christianity? Are you a speaker of your indigenous language? My problem with all this is that it's easy to find people deficient on those terms. Checklist notions of indigeneity, do you have these and these properties, don't work, because there are people who are rightfully indigenous people who don't fit those criteria.
It was in the past, decided at a certain point in history, and it's kind of arbitrary sometimes about who was where and which communities get defined as what. Always from an exterior source, right? And we have to always be mindful of the fact that this wasn't ours to begin with. It was a very deliberate strategy of dividing us so that we begin to fight amongst ourselves among the meager resources that are there.
For more than 100 years, the Indian Act stated that status Indians were considered to be wards of the state and were unfit to take care of themselves and their children. Aboriginal children across Canada were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to residential schools, a boarding school system created by the Canadian government and run by the churches. It was a way to strip Aboriginal children of their language and culture and assimilate them into Canadian society. Many students at residential schools were subjected to severe physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. For many survivors, attending residential schools was a negative experience that impacted generations of Aboriginal families and created a deep sense of shame about being Aboriginal. These historical and legal perspectives are aspects of how our identity is formed, but it was time to examine our backgrounds and cultural influences. I spoke with 3 members of Aboriginal communities in Alberta.
No matter where I meet Aboriginal people, one of the first things you ask is, where are you from? We identify with that, no matter who we are as Aboriginal people. Where are you from, eh? The Kikino Métis settlement. We're in the northeast part of the settlement now, so we're heading west. To the other end of the settlement is 20 kilometers, and then 20 kilometers to the south.
What does Kikino mean again?
That means our home in Cree. This is it. This is our home. The Kikino Métis settlement is 107,000 acres, 4 2/3 townships. That's a good chunk of land. It creates, opportunity for us. The Métis people were always good hunters, and they were always kind of tied to the hunting and having that ability to live off the land. So, those ties have always been there. On Kikino here, I am an entrepreneur. I have a buffalo ranch here, bison ranch. We have horses, we have pets. My wife's a dog breeder. So the entrepreneurial spirit is alive and well here. These big guys here, they're our team that pull our carriages. This here is Max and Jake here. A lot of our history was around the horses and everything else too, and in the early years there was transportation, and
give me some first.
A lot of times your life probably depended on it. Another way is keeping the culture alive is through the raising bison. Ties to our history in that. I've always had the dream of owning my own bison ranch when I was young. We as the Métis settlement members, I guess, are fortunate where we don't have blood quantum as part of the makeup of our of what makes you Métis or not. The Métis National Council definition is you have to be tied back to the Red River. So any one of those other nationalities with an Aboriginal woman could create a Métis person. Skin color, you see it where, I know my wife faced that a few times where she's fair-skinned and light hair, and people, oh, she's not Métis. How do you prove you're Métis? How do you prove your identity, whether your ties go back to Red River or back to Script or whatever, eh? Some of those issues are coming forward now. So that's another process that we'll have to define.
I grew up thinking I was full Aboriginal, I was just originally from the reserve. And it wasn't until I moved to the settlement that I actually developed the sense of, that I was a Métis person and that's who I was. I went through a really troubled time in my life. I started getting into drinking a lot and drugs. And missing school, just not having a care in the world. And I got really kind of depressed, and, I had a lot of issues with suicidal thoughts around that thing, and kind of, I just felt like I was stuck there and that there was nothing to do. So I called my dad, and I told him kind of what I was going through, and he invited me to live with him. And ever since then, I've been living in Buffalo Lake, and that was since the age of 14. I identify myself as a Métis, and I am proud of it. I love being who I am. I love having the heritage that I have. I'm very proud of it. I really feel tied to the Métis community, and I really want to go and give back to my community before I give back to anywhere else, because that's where I got my roots from, and that's where I kind of developed into the person that I am today.
I wanted to look into my own family roots and learn more about how my family stayed strong and kept our culture alive.
Can you tell me about you being an Indian princess?
I've always been an Indian princess.
Well, how old were you when you won that title?
I think I was 19 years old. I just got back from Ontario. And there was this princess pageant. And my mom said, okay, you want to run? I'll make you whatever you need, you know. So she made me my outfit. So I became the Indian princess, but we had to sell all these tickets, but we also I had to make a speech at the Friendship Center, and there were 5 panelists. And so I had to talk about my views as to what I wanted to do, right? It's a role, right? And I think a lot of people have to understand that there are different roles you play. But being Indian is not a role. Being Indian means who you are, the very person you are, the very essence of your soul, the roots that you come from. I was born in Greward, Alberta, small community on the shores of Lesser Slave Lake. From very humble beginnings. My mom and dad had to do a lot of things to make a living. And we were brought up with an ethic that said that you had to work really hard in order for you to be able to get where you want to go. And my mom was the driving force of our culture and making sure that we knew who we were. We always had that sense of pride, a sense of knowing, the sense of my grandma was always around, our aunts were always around, that maternal and matrilineal line was always lived to the fullest by my mom. She knew if we didn't know who we were, that we'd get lost somewhere, and she never wanted that. So she was always strong in terms of what she taught us and how she taught us, and knowing who we were, knowing the very essence of that identity. She taught us everything about life and family and how to survive in this world.
When you have strong ties to your community, you can go anywhere in this world, and you always feel safe that you have a place to go home. I know that the retention of your culture, a lot of it is based on the retention of your language. If you lose your language, you lose your culture. And we're very fortunate here to have our own school in Kikino. Cultural programs that they put into the curriculum is awesome. You know, they're teaching them Cree. They have fiddle groups in that. And they also did jigging. You know, that's part of the Métis culture. That's being taught in our school.
People know that I'm Aboriginal by my skin tone, but they'll know I'm Métis if they know about a Métis sash. And a lot of people take curiosity to this because they see the different colors and they figure it symbolizes something. So I'm glad when they ask. To me, I guess it's just it helps to identify who I am when I'm in public. A sash still is a symbol of my Métis culture and my Métis identity, but at the same time, I'm still going to use it for the same things our ancestors did, which is a tool, whether it's, you know, a scarf or just something to wrap around your bag and carry. So when I would actually wear my Métis sash around my neck, people would be like, oh, nice scarf. And I'd be like, actually, it's not a scarf, but it's a Métis sash. And I would start to, you know, kind of tell them about Métis heritage, everything that I do know I'd be willing to share, because I just want people to know that there are people out there and that we exist. Identity for me is just knowing that I have Aboriginal culture, and not only because of the color of my skin, it's just knowing that, you know, I have those Aboriginal roots.
Part of the current Indigenous world is those adverse circumstances and the scarring that that creates, but it can also create positive outcomes. You know, people can be motivated to reestablish their connection to what it was their parents and ancestors had in mind and how to live. And people all across Canada are doing that.
We have to be realistic about the fact that our societies and our laws have been impacted by colonialism, but we don't have to be defined by that. People are, on all different kinds of levels, pushing back the colonial story and creating new stories for ourselves.
So much of what's written about Native people, whether it's in the media or whatever's produced about us, is negative, and it kind of pathologizes Indigenous people. And so I wanted to write something that was like, well, no, it's not all negative, and in spite of all that people are up against, look at this magnificence that is there in terms of people's identities.
We have to start making sure people know and understand their language. They have to be able to understand the teachings in order for them to be able to come together as a people again.
Young Aboriginal people in this country are operating at a whole other level now. And a lot of them are becoming very sophisticated in terms of law and politics, and they're communicating this to each other with all kinds of social media, and a new world is coming.
It's up to us as the next generation to just take that step forward and, you know, not have to lean back on what had happened to our people, that, you know, it's up to us to push forward and just to, you know, create the change and be the difference for our future generations.
As an Aboriginal woman, I've come to understand that Aboriginal identity is a unique and personal journey, and legal definitions don't have the power to define us. We have to look to our vibrant communities, our loving families, our beautiful culture, and unique language to form our identity.
So next I would like to call upon Jen and Tyler to do the PowerPoint presentation and go through some of the content that we developed in regards to some of the most common myths that are heard. And I invite, and at the question and answer period, I have some team members here as well that can clarify and go into some more detail if needed. So I just want to call on, I guess, Tyler first, and just to start the presentation for us.
I'm just going to play the PowerPoint that was sent out to the participants who registered. If you didn't have a chance to read the fact sheet, then this will be a quick review because the PowerPoint was built from the fact sheet, and hopefully we can stimulate questions as we move into the question and answer period. So I'm going to go to the first slide, and this is about a misconception on the history of North America. So before European explorers discovered the New World, there are many different Indigenous nations living in what we now know as North America and Canada. Each nation had its own culture, political organization, language, spiritual beliefs, as well as trade and economic systems. So I think it's important to consider sometimes the different cultural perspectives where sometimes the dominant or the larger cultural group in Canada is coming from a exploratory, discovery, settled the land kind of perspective, whereas First Nations, Inuit, and Métis may be coming from a occupied since time immemorial, inhabited, and now have been colonized perspective. Our next slide is on terminology. And so the terms Aboriginal, Native, Indian, and Indigenous are sometimes used to describe a homogeneous group of people. Three distinct cultural groups are in Canada. There's the Inuit, the Métis, and First Nations, and each are recognized in Canada's Constitution. Each of these three groups has its own unique history, language, culture, and spirituality. And I am going through these slides quickly. I'm just trying to do a quick review and trying to stimulate some questions. And I want to leave as much time as possible for the question and answer period. And the last slide I'll do, or second to last slide I'll do before I pass on to my coworker Jen, is about healthcare. So medicine and medical care are part of the treaties negotiated with First Nations and with Inuit in a later time. When negotiating Treaty 6, Lieutenant Governor Alexander Morris said, "What I trust and hope we will do is not for today or tomorrow only. What I will promise and what I believe and hope you will take is to last as long as the sun shines and yonder river flows." So sometimes I think we hear that Aboriginal people get free health care, and that is a negotiated right. It's part of the treaties. And my last slide will be on most Aboriginal people live on reserves or in rural areas, and that can be a misconception because in 2011, 54% of Aboriginal people lived in an urban setting. And in Alberta, 43% of the Aboriginal population lived in either Edmonton or Calgary. None of it has the highest percentage of Aboriginal population at about 90%. So I'm going to pass it off to my coworker Jen, who's going to finish the last few slides.
The next slide, there's a lot of misconceptions about treaties. The treaty is just a negotiated written agreement defining rights and responsibilities for all parties involved. The federal government considers treaties to be solemn agreements that set out promises, obligations, and benefits for all parties. First Nations consider treaties to be bilateral, nation-to-nation agreements based on the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which basically just stated that lands could not be confiscated without some kind of an agreement being negotiated. Next slide, there's misconceptions. People will say, oh yes, Aboriginal people have all their post-secondary education paid for. It's true that the federal government does allocate money to First Nation and Inuit governments for students to attend a post-secondary institution, but this is in accordance with their treaty rights and the Indian Act. In some communities too, there's more demand than there are funds, so not everybody can have the chance to go. And non-status and Métis students do not receive any extra funding. Another misconception is about Aboriginal suicide rate. I think there's a common misconception that the suicide rate is always higher in Aboriginal communities than in the general population. And based on aggregate statistics, this is true. The rate is higher amongst Aboriginal communities. However, this is really variable. Some First Nations communities in BC report suicide rates as high as 800 times the national average, but some of them are close to zero. So you have to really consider specific community, cultural, and person level factors when you're talking about suicide rates. The biggest one, as Wab Kinew alluded to, was that Aboriginal people do not pay taxes. And really less than 50% of the Aboriginal population of Canada can qualify for tax exemptions. All Inuit, Métis, and non-status First Nations people are required to pay federal, provincial, and municipal taxes. Section 87 of the Indian Act exempts the personal property of status First Nations people only from taxation. So that would be any income earned on the reserve, or if they own a house or something on a reserve, they're exempt. Is that the end? That is the end of the slideshow presentation. So are we going to open it up now for questions? And I think Chelsea already has some questions ready to go.
I do. So Al, if you can open up the lines for us now. But I have received a couple of text questions already. So I might get some team members to help with these. So the first question is, and I don't know if it was answered for you within the videos, but we can add to it, is where do the Dene people fit in? Referring to slide 3, are they Inuit or are they separate? You want to come up actually, Pablo? Sorry, putting you on the spot.
Yeah, Dene are First Nations people. They are the ones closest, along with the Cree, to the Inuit people, but they are distinct. We have a distinct difference with our DNA from the Inuit people. But yeah, they are the ones living closest, but they are First Nations.
I'm going to do another text question, just so I give Al enough time to open up the lines. So one is, I currently work for AHS, and prior to this work, I worked for First Nations and Inuit Health Branch and provides coverage for Slave Lake, Grand Prairie, Peace River, and high-level reserves. I thoroughly enjoy the cultural diversity and appreciate the nature, but one question I always wanted to ask is, what is the best way to refer to your community members? Something you would appreciate instead of using term Aboriginal or Indigenous. So for me, I identify as a First Nations person, but I would always ask the person you're speaking with or the people you're speaking with, just ask them what their preference is or how do you identify is the way I go about doing things, and especially say from a healthcare context. Maybe through those questionings and when you meet with your client, it's just to ask them, like, how do you identify or where are you from? And through that dialogue, you can understand how they see themselves or represent themselves being in that Indigenous community. So it's really, like as the video mentioned, it's really, everyone may see it differently and describe it differently, but they are a part of that community. So hopefully I've answered that from my personal perspective, and especially others may have a different view. So it's really get it from that person that you're speaking with or the community you're with. The difference between status and non-status. So I'm going to bring David up here to answer that.
Chelsea?
Yes. Oh.
That's okay. I'll just wait till he's done.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Well, according to what was presented, it talks about the legal definitions for status and non-status. And one of the things that wasn't covered was Bill C-31 and Bill C-3. Non-status Indians, like I'm considered non-status. My mother lost her rights when she married off reserve, and her family sold their rights for script. And this is in Manitoba in the Treaty 1 area. So when she gave up her rights for script, we were entitled to get re-registered after Bill C-31 came into effect. But we haven't been able to locate the records for my mom being registered on a First Nations reserve because she was placed into a residential school at birth. So that's me. I'm deemed non-status. Status is people who are legally registered with any First Nations and acknowledged that way.
So we have approximately 5 minutes left. And there was a question in the room in regards to the health status of Aboriginal populations being lower or the same as the rest of the Canadian population. So there is definitely some health disparities, differences within the Aboriginal population to the Canadian population. So example, some key areas that you probably read about a lot is within chronic disease like diabetes, smoking rates, those sort of things. There is discrepancy. As indicated within the suicide rates, it does vary by community. We can't just paint a brush over it all, and it is quite higher than the rest of the Canadian population, but each community would be different. So I always encourage for people who are working with Aboriginal communities to really, be able to go out and understand the community or your neighbors that are living next to you and understand the community and how the community sees themselves and to get that information, because it does vary. You can get your information online, but I always say go right there and make those connections and to understand that. So hopefully that answers your questions, and I do have lots of information on that if you want to follow up with me. Okay, so
do you have a general question?
Okay, there's a question within a site?
Yes. I do have a general question. If a registered First Nation person moves off the reserve, lives in and works in an urban center in Alberta, do they give up all or some, or what rights, privileges do they have to give up?
So a person on reserve going off reserve to work, so hopefully I'm recapping what you're asking to make sure I'm hearing it correctly. Do they have to give up anything in regards to treaty rights to do that?
Correct.
Did I capture that okay? No, you don't have to lose anything. You are still a First Nation status person, so you do have access to what are covered in those treaty rights. So for myself, I can go and access healthcare wherever I need to go access it. And for any of the other rights, I do not give up either, so you don't lose anything. But historically, and this is just one example, before Bill C-31, is if a First Nation woman married a non-First Nation man, she would have to give up her status, so she would lose her rights. But that was prior to Bill C-31. So that's just a little more of the historical context.
Thank you. That's good, thanks.
Chelsea? It's Joanne. So, like, to that man's question there,
yes.
When a person does move off the First Nation, we don't lose, like, our status or our identity. However, we do lose things. We don't receive as much as on reserve people. When you're off reserve, you lose quite a bit of things, really. You can lose your housing. If you've lived on the reserve and you decide to move off, that house will be given to somebody else. Like it, and everything is on an individual First Nation basis. But it's on how the First Nation runs their band and its affairs. But like I know for me, if I move off and go somewhere, that my place, my home will be given to somebody else. So yeah, you do lose things by moving off reserve, but it's on the band level.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Okay.
Okay.
Yes. Thanks for clarity. Yeah, so, you're looking at different aspects of social determinants of health and, living on reserve or not. And yes, if you do have a home on reserve and you choose to leave, then that is, will be provided for someone else that is on reserve. So there's different aspects of things that got to be considered when someone is leaving the community. Okay, well, I do, because I know I'm going to get cut off very soon. Lots of dialogue. I know this is a different type of session, but I just wanted to have that chance to have, say, this will be number one of a series of these. I think it's great dialogue, and I like this dialogue to be brought into, your meetings and those sort of things. And if you have any questions for us, we just want to create that awareness and demystify those. So feel free to contact us. And I'd like to thank my team for their support in answering the questions. It is intricate, it is complicated, but we're trying to work together, and that's our ultimate for our clients. So I'd like to thank you for coming. Our next session is going to be held on October 28th, and hopefully you can attend. We'll be sending out the information for that a month prior. And please, if you want the links and didn't register officially, please feel free to text me your email address and we'll get those out to you. So thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon.